All right, I think we have a solid group of people who were able to join these first few minutes, which is really great. I'm sure some other folks will we'll continue to trickle in, but we're going to get started since there's so much that we want to cover today with our very special guest speaker. So welcome to our session today, participatory storytelling exhibitions. For folks who might not have joined us before, this is part of our oral history and practice event series that we've been hosting over the last started last year and are doing it again, hosted by our group organization Voice of Witness. I'll share a little bit more about who we are. I know there's some folks who might already be familiar with us, some folks who might be new to us. I'm going to share a little bit who we are in a second, as well as a bit more about this series. But for now, just want to encourage folks to take a look at some of these different workshop norms that we have for today. So this webinar is going to be recorded. So everyone who's registered will receive a link to the recording in the follow-up email after this session is done. So if you have to, hop off early for any reason, no problem. You'll be able to get the recording. And we'll also probably share some links to some of the different points that we talk about so people can get more information on those resources. We do have automated captions available. They're located in the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window. So feel free to reach out to myself or the square label Voice of Witness if you need any tech support with that. As we already shared, we encourage you to use the chat box for introductions and to share your name, pronouns, where you're based, including acknowledging the Indigenous land you might be on, sharing whatever orgs you're part of, and anything else you'd like to share. And we really encourage you to use the chat box throughout the workshop to reflect and share how you're feeling. If you're having certain curiosities or reactions to what our speakers are talking about, you can share it there. We really encourage you to make this a dialogue and to share with each other. We know everyone here is bringing a lot of insights from their own work and experiences, so we love getting to see those connections. We also are going to have a Q&A at the end. So if people want to use the chat box, you can put in a question and we'll keep an eye on it and return to it at the end for question and answer. You can also wait until the end if you'd like to ask a question there. And at any point you need any support or you have questions, again, feel free to message myself or the Voice of Witness square. So yeah, I'm seeing some familiar names in the chat, which is great. Love to see old friends, but also really exciting to see some new folks who are joining us. So welcome. We're really glad that you've found this space and that we're here together. So we are Voice of Witness, also known as VOW from our initials, and we are an oral history nonprofit. We've been around for about 15 years now. We first started in San Francisco, and now we're national. Our small but mighty team is located across the country, though mostly in the San Francisco Bay Area and in New York. And so we really believe in the transformative power of storytelling, particularly first-person narratives. And in these narratives, we really think it's important to amplify the voices of people who have been directly impacted and are also fighting against injustice. So we really believe in making space for and amplifying and listening to people who have direct lived experience of a variety of social justice issues, whether that means someone who is a refugee or an immigrant themselves, somebody who's been displaced by different crises, someone who has been impacted by the carceral system, the criminal justice system. So we really think about, in order to solve these human rights and social justice issues and to advance human rights, it's so important to listen to these people who have these experiences because they are the experts on these issues, because they have these lived experiences. And so often these are the folks who don't get the mic. So for us, it's all about deep listening and listening to folks who have these experiences that we want to uplift. And so we do this in a number of different ways. Our programming areas include our narrative and book series. We've published over 20 books currently through the Voice of Witness book program. Each book focuses on a specific social justice issue and includes stories from people who've lived that issue. You get a full sense of who they are and a real three-dimensional picture. So not just a soundbite, not just one moment, but really all the moments that make up a person. We also have an education series where we bring our books and our curriculum and our storytelling resources to schools and classrooms across the country. This really gives students a chance to, not only read these stories and learn about these social issues in a new way, but also to do their own storytelling, to do their own oral history projects. We've done things like podcasts and cookbooks with students, really cool creative things. And finally, we have our community partnership program, where we partner with folks who are doing direct advocacy and service on behalf of our communities that we work with, on behalf of our narrators, the people who share their stories with us. And we connect with them to see how can our storytelling resources advance the work that they're doing and really make a difference in the world. So there's a variety of ways that we work with folks, from educators to other nonprofits to grassroots advocates, as well as individuals. So if you are curious about, wanting to work with us, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk more and customize, doing a collaboration together. And so this series, we're really excited about the oral history and practice series. It's something we started last year, but we're really fortunate from our time as being an organization to be connected to so many amazing oral history practitioners and storytellers and artists who are really, showing what oral history means in action and what it means to use storytelling in a deeply community rooted way and a very ethical way, and to show how storytelling can really be connected to community in so many different ways. And so we were excited to have this series where we invite folks that we know, people who are friends of ours, to talk a bit more about what they do and take a deep dive into how, how they guide their projects, what principles they follow, some of the things that they're excited about from their past, but also the future, and really gives us a chance to see what does it mean for oral history to be in action and for all of us to learn from their own work. So we're really excited for our second session this spring. Mark is joining us, so we're very excited about that. And I already I skipped this slide, but I already kind of mentioned this, all the wonderful things of why we believe in oral history. Everyone, I covered a lot of these things. It's really great, and everyone should get involved in it. But anyway, so I'm really excited to finally hand it over to our speakers for today, who are going to have an awesome conversation. The first person I'm going to introduce is our awesome colleague at Voice of Witness, Fanny Garcia. Fanny is the editorial and program manager at VOW, and she's an independent oral historian as well, who works with immigration narratives. When she's not collaborating on and marking up manuscripts or teaching and scouting projects and partnerships, she's tending to her array of indoor plants. So I'll pass it over to Fanny for a second, just to say hi and to share where you're calling from.
Hello, everyone. I'm in New York City, Lenapehoking. I'm excited to be here with you today and to be in conversation with Mark, who is a really great friend of mine and whom I call in Spanish mi amigo del alma, my soul friend, my soulmate in all things oral histories and beyond. We're both also Central American. Mark from El Salvador and me from Honduras. So that also bonded us together when we first met. So Mark Menjívar is a San Antonio-based artist and educator. His practice primarily consists of creating participatory projects while being rooted in photography, oral history, archives, and social action. He is an associate professor of public practice in the arts at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Mark, did that change?
Well, I'm in the transition. It's like literally transitioning like this week, which I see some of my Texas State love to y'all, some of my Texas State faculty in the room. But yeah, I'm transitioning institutions right now. Yeah.
Amazing. And you've also worked on collaborative interdisciplinary projects with various organizations, including El Museo del Barrio, the Rothko Chapel, Eastern State Penitentiary, Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, and many more. He's also a longtime collaborator with After Violence Project and a core member of Borderland Collective. So, Mark, good evening, welcome. And this is our second installment of the Oral History and Practice series. I'm truly delighted to have you here with us. And I first came to know you when you basically served as my mentor when I was the fellow for the Oral History Association and the National Endowment for the Humanities, which when I think about it, that might be the last fellowship in a while in oral history. So I was really glad to have spent that time with you. And one of the things that I remember from that time, Mark, is that I kept asking you, I told you I've never had a time where time was my own. Not, it didn't belong to my employer. It didn't belong to someone else. It belonged to me under this fellowship. And you kind of, in our conversations, you gave me permission to like spend time going to museums and being inspired and
Mm.
thinking about how stories are being told through exhibits. So that was a really meaningful experience for me. Um, and today we're going to explore how you use oral history in your artistic practice and how you use it to create catalysts for meaningful exchange and engagement. This is something that you talk about every time in many different ways when we speak. So I'd really love you to dig into that in this conversation. But first, tell us where you are
Yeah.
and a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm in San Antonio, Texas. Coahuiltecan people were here long before I was on the Yanaguana on our river here. It's a beautiful place, just a couple of hours from the border. Um, to start off, I just want to say thank you, Ella, everybody from Voice of Witness. The amount of care that y'all have put into the preparation for this is rare, and I'm so deeply, deeply appreciative of that. And Fani, yes, like I'm so grateful for you. It's a little strange when you say like mentor because I kind of like take back a little bit because that's not how I saw it at all. It was really a space of reciprocity and of deep sharing and learning and growing. And it was almost like we were constantly pointing to things, right? Other resources, other projects, other things, and sharing that back and forth. And then also, I just want to say thank you to everybody that is in the room. Lots of names that I recognize, some people from my hometown, home institution, others that I don't know, and I hope to get to know you as we spend this time together. So thank you.
And
And do you have a question? I can't even remember if you asked a question or not. My brain's just already bouncing back and forth.
I know that the space behind you has a lot of meaning for you. So tell us where you are.
Oh, I am in, let me turn on my self view here and then I can tell you, even show you where I'm. So yeah, so I'm here in my studio. I'm really grateful that my studio is actually behind my home. And so like my house is out there. And then, but this is the space that I spend multiple days in a week and where projects happen. And yes, I do make things like photographs or other objects, but really this is a space to think, to be, to edit transcripts when I'm doing that, which is like, you know, transcribing, but a space to come together with folks in the community. But I feel really, yeah, privileged to get to have my studio behind my home. It really makes life possible. I have two kids and family in the city, so grateful to be in this space.
Thank you, Mark. And then my first question is really where does and where and how did socially engaged art and oral history begin for you? How did you merge those two practices?
Yeah, totally. Um, so you mentioned El Salvador. I do have to shout out. So that's my father's side. My mother's side is from Puerto Rico. So I really embrace both of those. And like culturally growing up, it was more Puerto Rican, even though I lived in El Salvador as a child in the 80s during the Civil War. And I bring that up just to point to like I had a youth that was full of violence. And for me as an adolescent, I didn't process that trauma in a healthy way, and it really led me into making a lot of really poor decisions and entanglements with the juvenile justice system and substance use. A lot of pain inside of that, but thankfully began to shift when I turned 18. And that shift, I didn't go to college right away. I ended up at community college where I completely fell in love with the process of learning. And then I discovered this field of social work. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was like, this is it, right? You know, getting to be in relationship, not just with people, but also thinking about context and communities, and then how we can kind of come together and hopefully thrive in that space. So I didn't grow up going to museums. I didn't grow up in the arts at all. I finished my social work education, moved to Bolivia, was working primarily with folks working in the sex trade. And when I came back to the States in my early 20s, honestly was like completely burnt out. And as a way of trying to begin caring for myself, I ended up picking up an old camera that was like laying around and started making photographs, became infatuated, turned my bathroom into a dark room, quit my job, right? You know, kind of did all of that stuff. But very quickly, what happened is as I was making photographs around social justice issues and primarily around food issues, I started having exhibitions, and it seemed for me really naturally to invite community members to collaborate and to do things inside of the space. And thankfully, as work started traveling and I started getting more opportunities, the opportunities for collaboration started to happen. And what then happened is I started caring more about what was happening inside of the exhibition spaces, the partnerships, than I did with what was happening on the wall. And not having much like art context or anything like that, I didn't know that there was a term called social practice or socially engaged artworks. And so where participation and collaboration is the core of that. And so when I found that out, it was like, oh my gosh, it was just like really kind of like a bringing together of all of those pieces. Still love photography and still use photography in a lot of projects, but for me, most of the work these days looks like participatory collaborative projects with communities.
And Mark, why do you think these different disciplines or art practices blend so well together
Mm.
with oral history and lived experience?
Yeah. Yeah. Oral history for me, I mean, the first time that I heard of oral history was in my undergraduate education around social work. I remember I like did like a 2 hour training and helped like one of my professors out on that. And for me, I think that story being embedded inside of it really made a natural fit. But I think I you say the different areas and you kind of mentioned them before. It's like photography and oral history, and social action, these different things. And I don't necessarily think about them as these like separate things. I do think about them sometimes as like tools in my toolbox and at the beginning of a project, or when I'm deeply haunted by something that's happening in the world or become incredibly curious about it and start to take those steps, I naturally go to that toolbox and begin to take out some of those tools. But like oral history for me wasn't, I mean, I got that little training, but the way that I really even came to oral history was I was working with another artist named Michael Nye. And Michael Nye does these long-term, sound and photography documentaries around social justice issues. And the one that we were working on together was around hunger. And so for 5 years, we traveled around the country, interviewed close to 100 people in over 35 cities, not just about hunger or food insecurity, but really deeply about their lives. And Michael's process of working over the years is he would have, it wasn't even, I mean, yes, it was oral history, but he would have these conversations for 4 to 6 hours, sometimes over multiple days. And I was in the conversations and listening to that. And then I did all of those transcriptions, which is why earlier when I did this, like, right, I mean, typing that out, I mean, it was years of transcribing. And I'm not a good typist, y'all. I mean, I'm like Hunt and Peck, so it was like really, really intense. But I think that, so we would have these 6 plus hours of audio and we would make transcriptions. Then Michael would begin to pull that audio apart and bring it back together into like a 4 to 6 minute audio story that you would then put headphones on and listen to, push play, and you would be looking at a portrait and hear that person speak in their own words about their own life. And the stories are so powerful. I encourage you, I think it's michaelnye.org, you can go to see all of those. Hopefully, we can drop a link in here in a little bit. But the stories are so powerful. And Michael, we would play the stories back for the narrator so they would approve their stories, which was really important. But I gotta tell you, every single time that I would listen to them, like at the end, I'd be like, oh, dang, like, why didn't this part make it in? Or why didn't this part make it in? Why didn't this part make it in? And I think it was like that process and those years of working with Michael began to push me to desiring like a longer format, right? Of not just maybe a 4 to 6 minute edited piece, but to find ways to really to bring in the whole of the narrative inside of that. And so that's really, I mean, that was it. And then, the first big project that I think really got me in on oral history was a project that I started called Migration Stories. And if you rewind your brain back, to 2014, tens of thousands of young people and families seeking asylum, fleeing violence in Central America. And we had an exhibition that was called Northern Triangle that was helping people really begin to look at U.S. intervention in Central America over the past 100 years and how that really still was connected to what was happening then in 2014, and I would say still what's happening now, of course. But at the opening, folks were coming up to me and saying, "Oh, like my family came from, I came from, my tío came from." And what they were doing is sharing their migration story. And I began to realize that almost all of us, right, have a migration story. Some of them are just closer than others. Some are held up and honored. Some have been stolen from us, right? But those migration stories have value, not just for our individual lives, but for our communal lives as well. And so that project was really the first one where was really deeply diving in. And yes, I was doing some of the oral history oral histories, but mainly what I was doing was holding oral history training workshops for communities, and those community members would interview their neighbors. And I just got to shout out the first place to host one was in Chicago, and I worked with grad students and PhD students at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. But the National Museum of Puerto Rican Art and Culture, which I saw somebody here put in the chat, was the first place to host one of those workshops inside of the museum, and I was deeply grateful for that. So
amazing. Thank you for all those connections, Mark. Let's dive into a project that I think is really beautiful that you created, called All Sacrifices You've Made, Todos los Sacrificios que has hecho. Tell us about this project with migrant farm workers and their family archives.
definitely, definitely. And I just got to shout out real quick. You mentioned in the beginning that I've been a core member, longtime member of the collective, Borderland Collective. And my dear friend, colleague, Jason Reed is not here with us today. We'll talk, I think, a little bit later about Borderland Collective, but I just want to just bring him into this space. He's been an incredible collaborator and friend. And this project begins when the Washington State History Museum, located in Tacoma, Washington, reached out to us and said, "Hey, we would love to do a project with y'all. Would you, be interested?" And we said 100%. We were immediately just struck by how a lot of the collection at the museum was about farm workers, and the Yakima Valley in that, in the state, huge agricultural area. And so when we started to look at the collection, we started to see, yeah, that there was a lot of work about people, but not a lot of stuff directly from people, right? That their voices were not represented. And so immediately we began to do research and ended up learning that that UW, University of Washington, had this incredible program called the CAMP program, which of course my brain just lost what CAMP stands for. But essentially what they do is they help support the children of migratory farm workers to be, first year in college, even throughout, provide them with, yes, relational support, but also some financial support. And so when we learned about the CAMP program, there was about 70 university students who were involved. And Luz Iguilez was our guide and our, mentor inside of that. Luz was running the program at the time. And she said, "Well, hey, do you want to come and do something? We meet once every 2 weeks." And so we came up with this with an assignment or like a prompt for them. And we invited people to bring in a family photograph and then to write about that family photograph. And then we had this beautiful time of sharing that with each other, some out loud, some in small groups. And then what we realized, it was so powerful, we then asked the 70 folks that were there, we said, "Hey, we're doing this project at the Washington State History Museum. Is there anybody that would want to work with us, to collaborate with us on this project?" And 7 students came forward and said, "Yes, we would really like to do that." And so that started off this process of working with them to select photographs, like this one you see right here that Gabriela brought in. And when she first brought it in, she thought that the little girl was her, but what she ended up learning through the process is that she was actually in her mother's belly at the time. So her mother is pregnant, and these are the orchards there in the Yakima Valley. And folks came in. You can actually go to the next slide if you want. But what the process was actually really simple is we just invited first thing, Jason and I traveled to the Yakima Valley and visited with folks in their homes and went through their family albums with them. And together we began to select photographs. And I mean, I have some of the audio recordings, like there was so much laughing and I mean, and tears as well, harder things, but just sitting in the living room, going through these photo albums and then beginning to select those photographs out. This is loose here with an example of some of the photographs. And then once we had selected those photographs, what we did is the youth from each family talked to their parents and to other people to learn more about the context behind those photographs. And then that's what we recorded. And so we sat down and it would vary. Some folks, it was, maybe 45 minutes of audio. For some people, it was 2 hours worth of audio that were there. And then you can go to the next picture here. This is an installation of the exhibition. And you can see that some of the photographs are on the wall, some actual like life size, some larger with a little bit of context. But I would say that the main kind of chunk or like piece of this exhibition is on the back wall. There was a monitor that is a 4.5 hour looping video of photographs kind of like being laid on the table, and then their voices are being played into the space. So you hear them talking about their families and talking about what's happening inside of that photograph. It's really was such a beautiful process. One of the things too, or sorry, go ahead, Fanny. Did you want to ask something?
Just really quick, no headphones anywhere in this exhibit?
No, and the reason was is because he wanted the voices to fill the space. That
Wow.
even if you were looking at a different photograph, right, there's something that you were hearing that there would be this maybe this intersection or a juxtaposition with what was there. And for me, and for what I heard from others, right, is that you really began to think about the stories behind it, or you begin to realize the assumptions that you make when you hear somebody talking about a story, and you begin to find ways that your own story rubs up against the story that you're hearing, against the photograph that you're seeing. And I think that immersive single voice being in the space was like really important, that it wasn't multiple voices kind of coming out. So
Did families have any concerns about giving their photographs, their family archives to the exhibit?
that's a great question. So one of the things that came early on is that the museum, and I think in just the way that they had worked, is that they actually said that they didn't want to show the photographs unless they were the originals. And Jason and I really pushed back against that because we were like, no, like, the most important place for these original photographs to be is in the family home, right? And so it took some back and forth that they eventually understood and agreed. And so they're all copies, and we're proud that they're copies, right? Because the fact that the copies are in the museum means that the original is back home. And I think in particular when working in different communities that have histories of like deep extraction, right? That people come in and have just taken for a long time. Like, how do we think about what we're doing and how do we value that original context first, right? And I think that if people, maybe eventually there can be a place for the photographs to be donated, but it was really built in that we did not take the original photographs out of the homes. Yeah.
Mark, what I really love about a lot of your work is that it is very intentional about not creating things for a community, but with a community,
Yeah.
and using public exhibitions as interventions for conversation within that community. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Well, and I think even more importantly, or not more importantly, but I think part of how that has come about for me is that like my entry into the arts was photography. And in particular, like documentary photography. And there are some, projects or people that have worked where they go to make photographs of a place or something happening and they bring those back to educate people. And like, there's a place for that. I mean, there's so many different circumstances, but for me, what I realized is it wasn't about making work about people, but it was making work with people. And that is very, 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 very different. And I'm incredibly thankful that I realized that kind of early on, that making some of those photographs. And I remember even like I lived in Bolivia for a couple of years and was working there. And then like I like came back to the States, got involved, fell in love with photography, and then went back to Bolivia kind of with that mindset of being like, oh, I'm going to make photographs and then go educate. And it just didn't feel right to me. Just the way of who I am and the ways that I want to be in the world just didn't feel right. So then that shifted. And I was like, okay, well then if you're not making work about people, then what does it mean to make work with people? And that looks different everywhere because I think, one thing you always hear me say this, right? It's not just about like what we're doing, but where we're doing it and who we're doing it with. There is no formula for working each way, because each context brings its own unique history, its own unique strength, its own unique voice. And so we have to constantly be thinking about that context, thinking about what we're doing, and then also who we're doing it with, right? If I'm working with youth that are living in San Antonio, it's very different than when I'm collaborating with my dear friends that are on death row here in the state of Texas. It's different if I'm working with university students in a different place, right? All of those layers of context are so important.
This is not a planned question, Mark, but I wonder if you think that your experience with social work uh, taught you anything about adapting to a community. Because I come from a social work background as well, and every time that I had to interview somebody, it was somebody new who needed resources, and I needed to adapt the resources I searched for to their story. So I
Yeah.
wonder, do you think that had any influence? Or how?
Yeah, you know what I mean? I think a similarity, it's interesting because I hadn't even thought about this, but like the way that I interview now inside of oral histories is not having a set list of questions. You know what I mean? It's about being present and responding and listening and trying to find the in between sometimes. And I think social work is you do that. It's not just macro skills, right? You got to have I had a professor, Dr. Gaynor Yancey, he used to always say, like, in order to have good macro skills, you have to have good micro skills. And because I was all wanting to do the macro. But I think like with the micro skills of like listening and being attentive, of tuning into yourself and realizing what you bring into the room, whether it's you're meeting with a client or whether you're meeting with a narrator for an oral history, or whether you're walking into a community meeting, right? Or something that you're doing. I think checking our own biases, our own baggage that we're bringing along with it is really important. And so, yeah, I like thinking about that connection between them. And I definitely, the skills that I gained in social work, I already mentioned like having this toolbox, but I definitely think that those are in there. And oftentimes, right, I'm pulling first from those social work tools when working on some of these projects with communities than I am about like my darkroom black and white printing skills or my audio skills or anything like that. That kind of comes later as we're dealing with materials and thinking how we make things public. So,
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for indulging me on that question,
yeah.
social work. Um, Tell us about I guess merging of artistry and education. How do you approach teaching students about the intersections of all of these different toolboxes that you've mentioned? And what skills or perspectives do you find most important to cultivate in the next generation of practitioners? You've been
Totally.
doing this a while, and not just with students in the classroom, but also with the people who engage with your
Yeah.
exhibits.
Definitely. I mean, I think that the first thing that comes to mind when you say that is like, how do you like I think being a curious person in the world is so important, right? Of wanting to know and to be like genuinely interested in the lives of people. And sometimes you can't make people have that, but I try to create as many opportunities for people to be curious and to to really focus on like what does it mean to listen, not to just hear, right? But to really deeply listen. And so I think I'm always trying to find ways inside of workshops or with students to lead to that. But also, it's like you don't want to serve up the whole platter, right? You just want to give like a little tasting because I think it can be so meaningful for people to like get that taste and then they find their own unique way of kind of following that.
Mhm.
It's also interesting because like for 10 years, I've taught at Texas State University inside of this studio art program. So I don't teach oral history. Like that is like I've never taught a class that is like this is an oral history class. I have taught some social practice classes where where like I have an oral history assignment, right? And some of that sometimes it's like they have to like find an existing oral history and then find a creative way to activate it in the world. So it takes out like the whole process of like interviewing and thinking about all those things, but just thinking about how do we make this make this meaningful for other people or make it possible for them to have a meaningful engagement with it. But then I'm always like trying to like cheat a little bit where like I'll come up with an assignment and then they don't know necessarily right away that they're doing oral history or thinking about interviewing. It's like one example that I've done with students for years is they have to find somebody who has a tattoo, and then they invite that person to draw that tattoo from memory. So it's like they can't look at it. So they just have to draw. And these are like, yes, some artists, but like a lot of like non-artists. And then after they draw the tattoo, then they interview them about the meaning or significance behind that tattoo. And so we go through like open-ended questions and what does invitation look like instead of just like asking or taking. So it's kind of embedded in it. And like the stories that people share are everything like from like oh, I was super drunk to like, oh, this represents like, somebody who's passed. So like deeply meaningful to deeply like hilarious. And then after they do that, they have to, record it with an audio recorder. Then they make a photograph of the tattoo, right? And there's all these like laughing moments because like people, you don't even remember what's there. So it's also talking about memory. Then they bring that back into the studio and they have to transcribe the audio. So they get that lesson, right? Of what does it mean? Because my dear friend and mentor Suzanne Snyder always says, right, like the oral history is the audio, right? And then you can have a transcript, but the transcript is not the oral history, it's the transcript of an oral history. And an edited transcript is not the transcript, it's edited and cleaned up, right? And if a segment is taken out of it, it's a portion. So you begin to talk about all of those things with the students. So they have the drawing, which they then scan, so they're getting scanning skills. They have the interview, so they have audio skills there, they're transcribing. They have the photograph, so then they have, photo skills of doing that. And then what we do is we lay it all out into a book. So each class has about, 16 to 18 students. So each book has 16 to 18 of these mini chapters. And then the requirement too is that they have to get the person's contact information and they distribute a copy of the publication back to the person as a way to close the loop, right? So while I'm not teaching oral history, that's just an example of, an assignment where in a studio art program, I'm beginning to bring all of these things in there. And at the end, they're like, oh my gosh, I've gained all these different skills from that. So.
And different layers of meaning, right? From body to art to story, identity. Amazing.
All the different things, right? And then it's like, and then, to talk about the curiosity part and listening, like I always say I give 5 points of extra credit if they work with a stranger because I want them to be working with people that they don't know. And so like I always am trying to get them out into the world, curious, talking to folks and kind of learning in that way. And this is like one of those like, I mean, that project in particular hits on so many other things. Which, side note, if anybody wants to do that project with your students or in a community, you can totally do it without permission, take it and use it. I see these as like tools, things that we just share with each other. But if you do, share it with me because I'd love to love to
Yes.
see what y'all do. So
And cite Mark if you can.
totally. Of course, Ashley, grab it.
Mark, my last question for you is about, again, going back to your work with Borderland Collective, but it's also an opportunity to talk about your work with the Blackwell School in Marfa, Texas.
Yeah.
And I think you have some slides for that.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
but tell us about your approach to working with a community, much like the one that you worked with in Washington State.
Yeah. Yeah, so Borderland Collective is a started by my friends Jason Reed and Ryan Sprott. They're from far west Texas, and it really began because they grew up in this like small town in West Texas. And as they started going, started college, they started learning all of these stories and narratives that had been completely excluded from the dominant narrative in that region. And so they started doing storytelling work along the border primarily. And the term collective, sometimes we can think of that as being something that's like exclusive, but really we try to use that term to be expansive. So like anybody that has ever done a project with us can be a part of the collective and say, I am a member of Borderland Collective. Like if y'all want to be in Borderland Collective, come on, right? It's like it's this expansive way of thinking about it. And so the Blackwell School, I wish I put a picture of the actual structure, but the Blackwell School was a school in Marfa, Texas, that during segregation, Latino kids went to. And it's a hard history in many ways. Blackwell School is mainly known for there was this ceremony, the burial of Mr. Spanish that the teachers did, primarily white English speaking teachers didn't want the kids speaking Spanish at school. So they buried Mr. Spanish in a funeral on the school campus, right? And it said you're no longer allowed to speak. And that, if you just even search for it, there's lots of great NPR stories about it. But the Blackwell School Alliance was members of the Blackwell School, or people who'd graduated, who were really trying to bring back the history and to preserve the building, which fast forward is now a national park site, which is really, really wonderful. But in 2019, when they reached out to us, they said, hey, Mark and Jason, will y'all come out, and do a project with us? And we were like, well, like we'd been to Marfa a bunch of times, and Marfa's really well known in the contemporary art world, but we were really hesitant because we didn't want to just like go out and do a project. So what we said is like, hey, why don't we come out and we'll meet with like the directiva, like the board of the Blackwell School Alliance. And we just like said, let's just have a conversation. And so we did. We drove out, beautiful big sky country. And when we got there, we started talking. And in the meeting, what happened is people started just like referencing these different things. And all of a sudden somebody said, oh yeah, the oral histories. And we were like, whoa, 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 whoa. We're like, what? And there was a whole, like somebody had done a whole oral history project, but just wasn't really organized. They were like, well, where is it? And they finally found it on a hard drive. And then somebody else mentioned photographs. They had a box full of photographs. And so we're like, well, where is that? And so really the project would emerge is all we did was help them begin to organize the photographs that were already there,
Wow.
organize the oral histories that were already there. And then we put out an open call to the community to add to those oral histories, right? To add to those photographs. And then you can see in this picture here, this is on the side of City Hall. There was like a large photograph, and then there's a little mini QR code. Like we were doing QR codes before COVID, right? In 2019. But what would happen is you go click on it, and then it would take you to this page where, and some of them were oral history excerpts. Some of them were like, there was like a conjunto band that made a song about the Blackwell School. So like one of them took you to listen to that song. Some of them were a little more abstract. And then we worked across 13 locations across Marfa. Ella, can you go to the next slide, please? And then what we also did, though, is we made a newspaper so that there was a way of kind of distributing them through town. And in that area of the state, there are a number of community newspapers. The Sentinel is there, a really, really great one. So there was already kind of this existing mode of dissemination of newspapers. So again, like you paying attention to what's happening around you and using existing forms that are there. Like we love making newspapers, but we didn't just make a newspaper because it was cool. We made a newspaper because there's already a tradition of newspapers in that community. And it was a way to begin to share and get the word out. And on the last page, there was like a map of like all the locations of where they were so that people could walk to them or drive to them to listen. So the photograph that you're seeing here is at the annual Blackwell School like celebration where we kind of unveiled the project. And what was cool, it was that like people came up and they were like, oh my gosh, like I dated her, they would see these images up. And so like this is a photograph of me then asking that person to be like, hey, like, like tell me more about that, right? And so we're adding to the archive. The archive is always growing and being activated in different ways. And it can happen like, yeah, you can record in the studio, but you can also grab it, right, and go out and, stand in front of wherever you are and record that story too. And I think it's like that idea of constantly closing the loop. Like, how does the loop continue to keep going back and around? Whether that's distributing publications into, first in the communities in which you're recording the stories or working in, or even this way, right? The archive isn't closed. Anybody can continue to add to it.
Thank you so much, Mark. I love, love, love that all of your projects are so collaborative and immersive. And this is something that I tell everyone who asked me about oral history that there's no need for only one person to do everything. You can work with other people.
Yeah, yeah, totally. One thing too, it makes me, I said earlier that like I love the like the longer format. And one thing that I've had to have tamed in working with communities is that like, because I'm like, oh, let's play the whole like hour-long narrative. And people are like, are you kidding me? They're like, I don't want to listen to a full hour. You know what I mean? They're like, so you have to, I've really had to listen uh to folks and think about audience, right? And think about how do we have multiple entry points into a project? How do you have multiple exit points? But like, so like even with this Blackwell School project, like some of the interviews were incredible, but we really tried to, narrowed it down to something that maybe somebody can engage with and have a meaningful moment with, while always pointing back to the longer, fuller piece and encouraging people to try to spend that time with the full piece.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And that brings me to the end of my questions, and I want to provide an opportunity for the audience to also share questions. So I'll pass it over to Ella, who will lead us in the Q&A.
Mm.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was fantastic.
Oh, thank you, Fani, for the questions and for, yeah, I mean, I feel like now I should turn all these questions back on you and we could talk about it for another hour.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ella, take it over.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just like processing that so much. And I found myself just, smiling a lot because it's such a, like, hearing a conversation between two friends is really lovely. And thank you, Mark, for just so many insights and reflections. I know I'm feeling like really inspired by your work. And it's just such an important reminder of like how really creative we can be while also honoring collaboration. Those two go hand in hand. And the more we, as you were just saying, the more we collaborate and work together, the cooler things we can do that can, continue to live on and continue to just reiterate and have an impact. So yeah, for folks listening in, feel free to post a question in the chat and we can read it out. A question for Mark, but also for Fanny, for all of us. Yeah, I think one thing I want to ask is, often you are engaging, Mark, you are engaging with histories that can be really difficult or painful. People talking about their migration journeys, their experiences along the border, which, of course, perhaps now even more so, like, have a lot of challenges and just emotions navigating that. So I was wondering, like, but also in your work, it is still infused, even with those painful experiences, there's wonder, there's curiosity, clearly there's joyful collaboration. So just wondering if you could talk more about how you bridge those kind of different emotions and how you approach that. And I imagine there's a lot of people listening who might want to do a project on, a project in a similar vein that involves difficult emotion. So yeah, how do you kind of respect all those different emotions in a project, and how can you approach a community, wanting to do this in a way that will feel respectful, feel inviting, even if it's a difficult topic?
Totally. Well, it's a really important question. And one of the things that I often think about is like, what is our posture as we begin to work with folks or work with communities? And the thing that guides me often in that is the word invitation. I've used it several times in here, but I think like a good invitation, like we understand as much as we can at the moment, like what we're doing, why we're doing it, what is our own kind of history with that and sharing that with people, right? It's not just asking a question, waiting for a response, and then trying to figure things out, but it's sharing as much as we can, even about like time commitment and who owns the work afterwards, like all of those things, thinking about that and then sharing that and then inviting people to participate inside of that project structure with you while also being open to them needing to shift the project structure, right? Maybe it doesn't work for them, or maybe you are a blind spot is pointed out to you, and not being defensive inside of that, but even like then shifting and growing from that process. And I think having like a certain like malleability, I think is really, really important for it. One thing that popped in my head too, as you were saying that, is that like there was a really hard, I don't know, yeah, hard interaction with the Blackwell School. We had somebody that showed up and contributed in oral history, and it was like y'all, it was like fire. I mean, it was like, I mean, they were sharing so powerfully and passionately about how, I mean, there was a lot of anger in it too about the effects of the segregation that it had on their life, and even some individuals that were challenging for this person. And like when they were done with the interview, we were like, oh my gosh, like that was like it kind of hit this exact narrative that you think about. And I mean, even some people that are in the room were like, oh, we've got to like hold on to this. That's such an important part of the story. But then like 2 days later, the narrator called and said, hey, I really regret doing that. And I don't want to have my voice on record from saying that. It's a small town and I actually don't feel comfortable with it. And so I gave that person a copy of their audio and said, you can do with it what you want. I erased everything from my audio recorder, no backup whatsoever, because that narrator is in charge of their story, right? No matter what I'm thinking, you have to begin to let that go. And also, there becomes a certain part of inside of these projects as well. You were talking about migration stories. Like we published, 7 books from this, and like everybody gave their permission. Some people didn't want to be in it, but like there's only so much that you can do once you make something public. And so you got to think about that, right? Like I can take something off of a website or delete something, but like I can't go back and pull like 200 books out of like out of the public. So I think it's recognizing those things and like planning as well as we can and learning from the mistakes that we make.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Mark. That makes me think of something we say at Voice of Witness is how do we create a safe, brave space for folks?
Mm.
Because we can't guarantee, safety when something is published. So, inviting folks to share what they need to feel brave, to feel courageous, to feel as supported as possible, given
Yeah,
that they're going to go out in the world.
yeah.
I see we have some more questions in the chat, which is great. One from Beth. Hi, Beth. Beth is the leader of the Amazing Warrior Women Project. Folks should definitely check that out if they have not. Beth's asking if you've ever used video and what that experience was like. And she's also curious about how you handle different legal releases and MOUs when you do so much collaborative work.
Definitely. So I've only done video oral history one time, and I worked at Fani mentioned earlier that I've worked extensively with the After Violence Project, incredible organization out of Austin, Texas. Well, actually not anymore. They're kind of everybody's dispersed, but I highly encourage you to spend time on their website. And the beginnings of After Violence Project was doing oral history with people that had been affected by the death penalty in some way. And I love watching those oral histories because you gain so much from the visual of seeing not just what somebody's saying, but their body language when they're doing that. I also love audio oral history where I'm able to close my eyes and it's like sound is so visual inside of it. The one time that I did a video oral history was around a very sensitive archive that had been censored, and so we decided, and the person wanted to show some of the objects as they were talking about them. So we chose to use video for it. And what I did is I brought along somebody who was a very skilled videographer so that I didn't have to run that. I didn't have to like worry about the tech while then also still being present to the narrator. And so I would highly encourage, if you're gonna work in video, depending on what your proficiency is inside of that, to really think about having multiple people in the room. It's awesome if you even doing audio, if you can have another person that's always monitoring sound, right? Because as you're immersed, you may not notice that the air conditioning next door, came on, or a truck's going by, or the refrigerator kicked in and you got to go unplug it. And I always say that like capturing good audio for me is really important because if somebody's going to take the time to share their story and be vulnerable inside of that, I want to capture the highest quality audio to honor them and honor their story and allow the people that are listening to it to really be fully present inside of that. As far as releases go, I, you know, I teach at a university, but I don't run my projects through the university, and so I function as an independent artist when I do that. And my releases are incredibly short and very clear, and they give ownership to the person who has done the interview, and then I get usage rights from that. And they also in the agreement, they can pull it at any time that they want. So I don't own it. I get usage rights to it. And I think that that's important. I know that's not the norm with a lot of institutions, and that can be really tricky. One resource that I'll point you to, I mentioned Suzanne Snyder earlier, but Suzanne runs Oral History Summer School. I did Oral History Summer School like 8 years ago, maybe, and it completely changed my life. But Suzanne has a really incredible collection of different release forms that people use, and you can see the full gamut inside of that. But I think it's important to have clear language that people can understand, not just the legalese. And sometimes we maybe need to create another document to help translate that, especially when we're coming from academia or a larger institution.
Thanks, Mark. I think I know we
Yeah.
have just a couple minutes left, so maybe just time for one more short question. John was asking about if you could talk a little bit more about doing activities at the beginning of an oral history interview, kind of like the tattoo sketch you were talking about. And, is it something you do often, and like what that purpose is like for you, to
Yeah.
start with an activity like that?
Totally. So typically what I try to do, as I mentioned earlier, I don't start off with a list of questions, but I kind of have some questions that I like to ask people. And I typically, when you start the interview, you're trying to make people feel comfortable, to try to settle in. A lot of us, right, we experience a little bit of nervousness, whether we're being interviewed or interviewing. And so I think like, asking somebody to introduce themselves. I do this, a lot of people do these silly things like when you're just trying to do the audio check of like, tell me what you had for breakfast. But I often like to ask people early on a question that they maybe never been asked before. So like what an example of that is, I've asked people like, how did you heat your home when you were a child? Right. And that leads to all these ways because they're like, oh my gosh, I had a wood, we had a stove, or we actually didn't have heat, right? Because it was super hot where we were. Another question that I love asking people is like, what was the view outside the window from your childhood bedroom? You know what I mean? And so it's just like thinking about like most people don't think about that, but it also, and there's like almost no question that can it just elicits different thoughts. You know what I mean? And also needing to recognize like some people, when we think of the word home, can be really troubling, right? Some of us came from a home that was positive and loving, and others of us came from homes that were horrible, right? And we needed to escape from that, or we had childhoods that were good. And so trying to think through those things as well. But I also think about like it's often not just what we're asking, it's also how we're asking it. And I think a lot of times the question of like, where do you come from? Like that can be used as a weapon, or it can be serve as an invitation for people to truly be vulnerable and talk about their people and the land that's important to them. So it's not just what we're asking, but also how we're asking in the environment that we're creating.
Thanks, Mark.
Kar-
Oh, sorry. Go
I was
ahead.
just gonna say that one thing, Karine, if you email me, I'd be happy to share some of my releases with you, and that goes for anybody in here.
Yeah.
So
Well, thanks so much, Mark. I feel like the hour flew by so quickly. Just want to give another really big thank you to you from all of us at Val, all of us here, for sharing such a really lovely and inspiring conversation, and sharing all your insights and ideas. And you're just really appreciative for this conversation and your generosity. Big thank you to Fanny for facilitating, and to my colleague Anaik, who's behind the scenes doing all the tech stuff.
yes,
And thank you folks for joining us. I hope that if you enjoyed this session, we're going to have our last oral history and practice session in a couple weeks on May 21st, the last one for this session this spring, which is about documenting refugee stories. It's going to be a really great call. So hope you'll join that. We're also going to have our annual summer workshop series around August, which is an overview for getting into some of the nitty gritty of oral history, like interviewing, editing. Registration for that is opening soon. Like I mentioned before, if you want to partner with us or work with us in different ways, whether you're an individual or an educator or part of an org, we'd love to talk to you. So feel free to reach out to us. My email is here, or through the submission on our website. Follow us on social media. Go to our website. There's tons of resources there that will help you you'll find helpful. And just want to share also, if you know, this is a very tough time, as people know, for a lot of nonprofits, particularly in the arts. And so we just want to ask if people, you know, are able to contribute in any way to support us to do more work like this, like having these conversations with our colleagues in the oral history field, as well as continuing to do narrative projects that are based in community. We appreciate any support people are able to share. But even if it's not monetary, just spreading the word and sharing about this community-centered work really means a lot to us. And so we appreciate not just, you know, not just donations, but all the time and energy and care that people have for us and the work we do. And we just have so much care for all of you out there. We know, especially for folks engaged in the arts, there's a lot going on. And so just a shout out to everyone who is engaging in cultural memory work and listening and storytelling in so many different ways. Your work matters a lot, and we support you, and we're rooting for you and cheering you on. So thank you all so much, and hope to see you next time for one of our next sessions. Everyone take care. And there's finally in the chat, there is a survey if people want to give any feedback to help us continue improving our webinars. So thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon and evening.